Hello. Today's video interview will focus on creative research in connection with archival research. My name is Nike Pokorn, and I come from Slovenia, from the Department of Translation Studies at the University of Ljubljana, and I work in the field of translation studies. I've done research on translation into a non-mother tongue, on ideology, as manifested in translations, on community interpreting, etc. But the methods that I've used up to now are pretty traditional. From textual comparisons to questionnaires, semi-structured interviews, bibliographical research, but also archival research. This interview is done for the benefits of EUTOPIA Alliance for the students at the MA and PhD level enrolled in the course Research Methodologies, and for the PhD students whose home institutions are members of the International Translation Studies Network. Outi, what about you?
Hello, I am Outi Paloposki and I work at the University of Turku in Finland in the Department of English as Professor of English Translation. And my research interests have largely been involved with translation history throughout my research career. And I have studied things such as translators' agency or comparison of texts, especially in retranslating, in the phenomenon where texts are being translated anew into, in my case, into the Finnish language, together with my colleague Kaisa Koskinen from Tampere University. And recently I have been doing more and more archival studies, and this is something that's quite close to my heart at the moment.
Thank you, Outi. I should add that Outi is one of the most prominent researchers in the subfield of historical translation studies research. She's also one of the promoters and collaborated in creating a comprehensive translation history of Finland. Now, our interview will focus, as we said, on the creative use of archives. In particular, what I think we are both interested in is this microhistorical translation studies research. Would you be so kind, Outi, to briefly describe what constitutes microhistorical research in translation studies, and when should one decide for such a approach in the research?
Yes, microhistory as such does not start in translation studies. It obviously comes from elsewhere, but it has been made known in translation studies, perhaps most of all by Jeremy Monday, who has done microhistorical studies in translators' archives. And here's where the archives and the historical bits sort of get together or meet. But obviously what microhistory is about is it is about people, it's about translators, and in that sense it kind of continues the sequence of calls to focus more on the person who is behind the translations. Like, as we know in translation studies, the focus largely was on the translated texts in the beginning, and it still is, and they are an important part of translation studies. But who is the person behind all those texts? Who are the persons? And what is the variety and the differences between these people? This is what we are looking at. And microhistory is a way of finding out in history what the translators, who they were in history, what were their personal circumstances, what were their conditions of work, working practices, their identity. These are the questions posed by Jeremy Monday when he was calling for more research on archives and on translator studies, something like 10 years ago. And if one would like to make a comparison between biography and microhistory, which are both kind of frameworks for looking at the people behind the work. Biography usually is done on single individuals, and we are perhaps used to seeing quite huge volumes of biography books in bookshops, for example, where well-known people, often male writers, politicians, statesmen, are portrayed, and it's kind of an account of their lives, perhaps mostly about their careers, but about other sorts of things in their lives as well. But they focus on generally on one single person, whereas microhistory has the kind of an understanding that when we look at a case study, when we look at an individual translator, we can then combine the insights into a kind of a whole of the socio-historical context where that person lives and works. And we look at the different cases, at the different translators, and create an understanding of what were the more widespread translation practices, for example, in those days, the translators' tools, what they used, their strategies, what they thought about, their personal experiences, and we can access a kind of a bigger picture of translators during a specific era or time. And often also it's when we are talking about microhistory and translators and archives, we are trying to focus on people who have not been studied before. There are biographies of also non-famous people, but microhistory is more into the exploring the lives of people who are not well known, who are often called ordinary or even neglected, that they haven't been looked on in history with as much time and care as they probably might have deserved. And this is also what microhistory is doing. Maybe some of these issues, some of the name tags we assign to these people, like ordinary or neglected, could be problematized a little bit, and maybe I'll go into that later. But this is it's a good way to start talking about what microhistory is, and in translation studies, how translators have often been left sort of, they are behind the scenes. We do not know a lot about them, and now we are trying to focus more on them.
Indeed, giving voice to those who seem to have been silent. When you write in your article that was published in the Translator in 2016 that translators often do more than just translate, but that this additional work is very often invisible to the public. What constitutes this additional work, and how can we study it if the translators, of course, who we want to study, are no longer among us, so we cannot ask them or interview them?
Yeah, that's a very good point. We cannot ask them questions, but we can listen to them. We can listen to their voice. You said in your previous comment, you were talking about the voice, giving voice to those who haven't been listened to previously. So in the archives, what we can do is we can listen to what they say. And the interesting and kind of a nice point in this is that since they don't hear our questions, they don't know what we are asking, they cannot be steered by our questions either. So they are not under pressure of answering what we are asking and only what we are asking. And the benefit of that is actually that they give out more than what we even knew would be there. They are talking about things that we didn't expect to find. And this is fascination of archival work to me. It may be the greatest fascination is that I find things that I didn't know existed. They are talking about things that I wasn't even aware of, and it's a good starting point. Of course, always when you go to the archives, you do have some questions in your mind. You can never go with a completely blank mind and a kind of a tabula rasa. We don't know anything about them. We usually have some kind of a context of what we are going to do, what kind of an archive we are going to go into, and what kinds of papers we are going to look at. But that doesn't always prepare us what we then are going to find. The invisible things that translators do, the kinds of things that I have found in the archives, going through the documents and the papers that translators have left behind, first of all, to do with their own work, like the different phases of their work, what they do. And this often comes out if you look at the correspondence with their publishers, because they propose books to the publishers. And many people know that this is the case, but we haven't known how and to what extent they do this. What kinds of books they propose? Are they rejected or are they accepted? Are they given instructions on how to go about, or do they themselves give instructions to the publisher, perhaps? Maybe they are more active than we had previously thought they would be. So there's a lot of clues to this in publisher translator correspondence in the archives. And also about the visual layout of the books. They may say something about the illustrations. They compare different versions of the source text, and maybe some mediating texts or other language versions. And they give their ideas about typography, these kinds of issues that we might not have known that they do. So they appear as more independent as what we perhaps thought. So these are some of the things. Then there's a question of strategies, how they translate, and of course we can look at the texts. And here the textual study is also important, comparing the source and mediating and target texts. But that doesn't give us that doesn't let us know, for example, who was the initiator of a certain strategy. Like Gideon Turi is talking about norms and macro and micro and all this. So we can start from this idea of macro strategies, whether the book is an indirect translation. Why is it an indirect translation? We may be able to find it in the archives. It may be that the publisher and the translator both wanted to do it from the source text directly, but they couldn't get access to it. Because like the archives I have been studying, they are about 150 to 180 years back. And in those days, it wasn't so easy to get the originals, the source texts. So they sometimes needed to just take some mediating translation and work with that. And they may comment on it and on possible mistakes they find. And they may go into big efforts to find out why and compare with other translations, do kind of a comparative work with other translations to try and work out what it said in the original, even if they can't access the original. So these kinds of strategic decisions often come out in the correspondence. And also things like annotations, whether the publisher wants the book to be annotated, whether they want the translator to write footnotes, or whether the translator actually themselves they propose adding footnotes. That may come up in these texts in the letters to the publisher. All sorts of things that have to do with their own translations, but also other things that they do that may have to do with the world of translating in general, but not their own translations. They may recommend books or act as scouts for the publisher, and that's a very important thing that translators often do. They not just translate their own work, like the work they are translating themselves, but they help other translators in finding new translations, new source texts. And then there's the process of work getting translated, the pace of it, how quickly a translator delivers the texts, how much they need to correct or revise or edit their own translations, perhaps, or whether they are quite sort of fast in doing the whole thing. There are variations in this. And also so we get to see kind of a glimpse into the unfolding process of translating, how the translator comes into being. And also one of the things that I didn't expect to find in the archive is the opposite of translations in the making. It's when translations are not published. The translation is being made, but it never comes out. Why is this? And in the archives, you may be able to find reasons. Maybe the publisher already found out that there's another translation in existence, so they don't want to obviously publish a competitor to that one, or something else happens, or the translator never manages to finish the translation. There are all sorts of reasons for this that may appear in the correspondence. So these things become available for us in the correspondence and in the different papers while we go along in our archival work.
So indeed, so you see that a person who is usually just acknowledged for the only translating, in fact, does promotion, interpretation, technical aspects, illustrations, as you said, covers, all that. So many layered work of the translators. So what kind of archives do you use and can be used by the researchers that are involved in microhistorical research? Um, could you tell us what are the pros and cons of the existing archival collections?
Yes. Well, of course, first of all, the existence and the organization of archives depends on where you're situated, like on your location. Most nations, most countries have a kind of a national organization of archives where sort of the state papers are being kept. But sometimes these archives also house perhaps publishing companies' papers or private papers, or if the person who has been translating has also some importance in the political history of that nation, then their papers might be stored in the national archives. So then there's the literary archives that might be housed by literary societies or translator societies, author societies in a specific country. And there are university archives in university libraries often, which may house private collections of translators' papers. And there are private collections too, which are the most difficult of all because they may be situated in places we don't know of. We may not be even aware of their existence. There may be archives there that nobody knows about. There are hidden archives still, like the story about de Saussure's papers that were found in a garden shed like 50 years after or something after his death. And I have a translator. I study a translator whose papers were found 50 years after his death and were donated to the National Library in Finland. So there's differences in the national organization of archives and libraries in this. And I think I consider myself quite lucky because in Finland we do have some cross-referencing. We do have some sort of work having been done on private archives and where they are situated, so we can access the National Archive database and look at whether a certain person whether we would be able to find their archives and where. But this is, of course, not the case everywhere. Besides, on top of this, we have an ongoing project in Finland by Laura Ivaska and Sakari Katajamäki, who are two researchers affiliated to the Finnish Literary Society and the University of Turku, and they are doing work on trying to compile a database on translators' archives. Unfortunately, all the material is in Finnish that they have produced on this project, but there surely will be something in English as well, and like how it is to work on such a project, how difficult, what like challenges there are, and what they manage to find out, and maybe some kind of best practices for somebody else who would like to do a similar kind of an archival collection or database in their countries. But of course, what Jeremy Monday was looking at were largely the papers were largely housed in the authors' collections. The authors whose work had been translated by the translators that he was studying. So you have to look at different kinds of sources to find out whose archives are housed where. And that's, you were asking about the pros and cons of the different archives. And of course, this is one of the cons that is really difficult to work if you don't know where to start. And the collections are not cross-referenced. But I would advise you to sort of go and ask, if you want to do this kind of work, to go and ask in the archives. Maybe start at the literary archives and then go on to the national archives and ask the persons there, because they are the best provided in helping people on where to find what you're looking for. But then the other problems, of course, in working in archives are that the work is really time-consuming. You have to be prepared for that, because you never know what you're going to find. But this actually is also the pro of the work, because as I said, earlier, you don't know what you will find, and the archives are so rich often that you may find something completely unexpected, and that will brighten your day then, and you can go on with that. So it's maybe not distinguishing between the pros and cons, but seeing them as kind of entangled. Like there's always a silver lining for these clouds as well. If you go to the archive, you have to get used to old handwritings, for example, or maybe if it's a later archive, it's easier that it's like maybe typewritten. Or we shouldn't forget digital archives as well, because many old materials have been digitalized, and then there are the new digital archives that also house or collect translators' papers, and they are, of course, already a bit easier to use because there's not the problem of handwritings, there's not the problem of torn or partly burned old papers like you may find if you go to an old archive and there has been a fire in the archives. And so all these problems are, of course, difficult if you encounter them, but then you also get the touch, the feel of the person when you're looking at these old papers, and you sort of in a way it opens up their world for you in a different kind of a way. So this could be a kind of an entangled process of problems and solutions in one.
Indeed, and it's true that I had the same experience. You just the people who work at the archives can be of extreme help. They know much better their way through what they already have in their boxes and folders. And it's rarely that you would find just translation as an entry, and that you can then find the exact material that you want to. Probably, Outi, you agree that the archives take a lot of time when you're there. You may be there for days and find nothing. And particularly difficult is when we are dealing with people who are not, as you said, prominent members of the society. Feminist researchers have argued that when we attempt to reconstruct female subjects from the anonymity of history, and the same could be said for translators, there are also the notoriously anonymous in history. We need to extend, and this is what they argue, we need to extend a traditional notion of archive. But the question is, in what way, Outi? What are your thoughts about it?
I think this is very true, and I think it also sheds light on the fact that we can never rely on just one source. Like previously, we used to rely on texts mostly, but then we get more information from the archives and on how those texts came into being. But even archives don't tell the whole story. First of all, of course, like you said, there's many things that don't even appear in the archives. There's people whose work or correspondence has not been archived, and then, or it has been lost. The archives may have got lost, or somebody may have accidentally misplaced them, or whatever. There are all kinds of reasons why we don't find something in the archives, that always needs to be remembered. So we need to take recourse in other kinds of sources of material, and in this extensive archive idea, I think what is the main idea is that any kind of an object or thing that is related to the person could be useful in shedding light on the person too. So, like one of the things that I have been doing is trying to reconstruct the translator's workspace, the desk, and trying to see what they had on their desk. And you do not always get that information from the letters. You may in a way infer what they. You can see that they're using a pen, they're using a typewriter, whatever, but they may not talk about it directly. But they may have possessed things that may have given clues to what kinds of reference books, for example, they were using. So these are really useful if you can access these sorts of objects. And here we go into a kind of a discussion on the difference between museums and archives. And obviously those two are related. But there are other sources as well. And I think maybe seeing this also as a kind of an entangled issue of archives spreading into extended archives, maybe museums, maybe the whole environment in which the socio-historical environment in which the translator lived, what was possible for them, what we can expect that they might have used, but also then things like paratexts are useful, and all kinds of contextual texts and biographies, not just of them, but of other people, the people they were working with, for example. And also, if you do find like somebody who has studied the era, the specific era, those people are useful in, and their writings are useful in trying to contextualize the translator's space, the kind of space they have inhabited in those days, and other people's archives. Of course, archives are kind of they are overlapping. The letters of a person that I am studying may be largely in his or her archive, but then again, it may be that some of the letters are in different archives and they have not been cross-referenced. So I need to go and try and find out what other people they were mingling with. And this is also, you could perhaps call this an extensive archive. You're going into other people's archives, doing archival work similarly as you would be with this person that you're studying. So there's there again, you see maybe the difference between the biography and the microhistory. Microhistory is sort of looking at the more general issues and the wider space the translator is inhabiting, but collecting it from different cases.
Indeed. So basically, what you're saying, that if sometimes we do not have anything in the traditional archives, we may or we should then create our own archive by looking at other archives, at other sources, and also at the material and the material elements or objects that surrounded the work of a particular person. There are, of course, then certain issues that emerge when we venture on such a path that are connected with ethics. Are there any ethical considerations, some, let's say, negative, positive aspects when doing such a research?
Yes, that's a really good question, and one that I have been thinking about a lot lately, and I don't think I can say anything determinate. Like usually you are not able to do that if you're talking about ethics, because it's every single occasion you have to sort of think about it again. And one of the things, of course, is that you're sometimes you're looking into very private papers, very private persons who never maybe even thought that their papers would be divulgated to general usage. And of course, some archives have different access restrictions, and you have to respect those. Like, you may be allowed to look at those papers, but you may not be allowed perhaps to quote, for example, or use the quotes in a specific way. So you have always to think about how to maintain the balance of not divulging something that might be considered unethical, for example. It's difficult because in a way we are trying to explain also things like why translations were coming in late, why was a specific translator not accomplishing what they were supposed to be doing, and we find things that have to do with illness or with personal relations and this sort of a thing. So what do we want to do with this? How vaguely can we kind of encapsulate these things so as to prove the point, but not unsettle the balance between the intimacy of this person and cross the boundary, somehow being unethical. Another thing to do with ethics is the ahistoricity. It's also that we shouldn't judge the people along the standards we have today, and that's also a kind of an ethical issue. We have to think about our own position as researchers, and I think in a way, if we are looking at this, if we are wanting to give voice to those who haven't been heard, we are in a way some kind of making it making kind of an activist stance as researchers. And I think there's a good article by Kaisa Koskinen in 2010 where she was talking about the different positions translation study scholars may take up. And I think that would be a good one for anybody interested in ethics in research to read, because how to balance the activism we may have in ourselves and the ethical issues, and in a way giving voice, and again not breaking the boundaries of intimacy and the self, the kind of issues that people would not want to divulgate about themselves if they were asked today. Like, what kinds of issues would you perhaps not want to be discussed as in general? And of course, anonymity is one of the things that comes into play here. We can give these people anonymity even if we sort of lift up their voices.
Mm-hmm. So all the issues that maybe are easier to solve today, when we can ask the person to give a consent, and of course you can also control the amount of information you give. Here with the archives, these boundaries are no longer there, but this just means that we have more responsibility. And in that direction, Outi and we have also formed a task for the students, which would consist of work in pairs. So you should consider yourself a research subject. So each of you is a research subject. And please have a look at the items you have on your desk if you're at home, or in your bag or backpack, or whatever you have here in the at the faculty with you. You have 5 to 10 minutes to identify the objects and draw up a list of them. That will be a kind of an extended archive. Then you will talk in pairs with your colleague, and the colleague will be in the role of a researcher, and he or she will attempt to reconstruct your personality, working habits, attitudes towards life, worldview, likes, dislikes from the items that you have found. This will take a few minutes, but then we will discuss some of the issues. The issues would be, do you agree with the findings of your colleague about you on the basis of what they found? And could such a research completely replace other more traditional research approaches, such as traditional archive research? And finally, if this research is also ethically problematic, and what kind of ethical issues arise when using this kind of research methodology? Outi, any advice to the students?
For this present task, I think you could think about how you would want to be portrayed by the posterity if you were being described later as translator or whatever. And then you can also, when you talk in pairs, you can also talk about the sensitive issues that you think that might come into play, what you feel is a sensitive issue, and how does your pair react to these sensitive issues. Yes.
So then let us thank Outi once again for her presence, and let's do our task and discuss the issues at hand. Thank you very much.